So today we're going to take a look at literature and science, and we have the Horn Professor of Literature and Science, I believe. Is that the full title? Yes, indeed. Literature and Science. If you're in the class, you already know. Though you may not know, let the cat out of the bag here, that folks in my generation and many aficionados of music of later generations know him as the drummer for the rather famous group back in the 60s.
Bass player.
Bass player. You weren't the drummer?
No,
Keep telling people.
I was Jock.
All right. Sha-na-na, you've heard of them. And a Renaissance man in every respect and a celebrity on campus. So he's done great things in literature as well, which is why he's our Horn Professor in Literature, and also why we're having him here today. He's written a good deal about the relationship between fiction and science. His latest book is Energy, Power, Allegory, and Science in the Era of Classical Thermodynamics. Well, that's not your latest book, is it?
No.
But it's certainly a book that fits the week we had. And there are many other books too. Let me now bring you the piece de resistance. What are you laughing about? Shame on you, he's your professor. Maybe you're laughing at me, that's quite all right. Let me introduce Bruce Clarke.
Thank you, Steve. All right, thank you, sir. Did everyone in my class get their signature on the sign-up sheet? We all good? Okay. So, okay. Just very quickly, so this talk I fashioned out of some of the, actually this book that Steve met, so is this one here, Energy, Forms, Allegory, and Science in the Era of Classical Thermodynamics. So in this book I wrote up about the time machine, and which is where I'm going to start with the talk today. So the footnotes and the references, if you would care to follow up, are in the book, but I've left them out of the lecture. And then then I'll also talk about this problem here. Hello. Well, anyways, never mind. Dr. Moreau and War of the Worlds. Hello. All right, never mind. Let's try that. That. Oh, and let's go back. There. Okay. Anyways, I left the references out, which of course I want to see in your essays. When you write, you put your works cited and you'll refer to your secondary sources, but in this talk I'm not going to be that pedantic, but oh, and also towards the end I talk about posthumanism, and that's, I think, my latest work of editing. I'm the co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to Literature and the Posthuman, and I'll talk briefly about the posthuman apropos the third Wells novel, and then I'm going to talk really briefly about Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End, which we'll read just a bit later in the semester. Okay? All right, Anachronism in Science Fiction and Science, the case of H.G. Wells. So this talk takes a look at the works of H.G. Wells that we're currently studying in English 3309, Science and Modern Society, as seen through the critical lens of anachronism. Now, anachronism is defined as a thing belonging or appropriate to a period other than that in which it exists, especially a thing that is conspicuously old-fashioned. And of course, I mean, that's usually an anachronism is something that's out of date or old-fashioned, but here, which is the anachronism? You see, it goes both ways. the cell phone or the digital camera is an anachronism relative to the girl with the pearl earring by Vermeer, right? So it's, anyways, but I love this. I don't know who this guy is. Maybe he's Ed Bacon or somebody, but that's a very mean electric guitar that guy's got there. But just a little out of place. So that's kind of the idea of anachronism. Now here's a saying that never goes old. Ars longa, vita brevis, art is long, but life is short. But whereas artworks may endure across ages, and core components of the human condition are perennial, many scientific ideas have relatively short durations as newer understandings displace older conceptions. In other words, in science, as a self-renewing research activity, there's an ongoing revolution or turnover of conceptions about precisely how reality works. And yet, superannuated or worn-out scientific conceptions happen to get preserved in the amber of artworks, and these scientific anachronisms also become intertwined in these artworks with traditional as well as modern and contemporary thought patterns. That is, with cultural conceptions that may or may not also be anachronistic in their turn. So we can think of culture at large as a complex field of various objects, various notions with variable temporalities. Ideas come and go, but they do so at different speeds. Some die quickly, others linger past their expiration date. Historical knowledge tries to grasp, coordinate, and make sense of these differences. And in the field of literature in particular, the genre of science fiction is an especially sensitive seismometer of these cultural tremors and shifts in ideas and conceptions. So one of the ways that I do scholarship in the mode of literature and science then is by turning critical attention to the unfolding of these crumpled up historical matters. Okay? That was called an introductory paragraph. You got the, okay, so now we sort of know where we're going. So let's consider the way that science fiction has colonized, the genre of science fiction has colonized the narrative device of time travel, which of course didn't begin with science fiction, but now we think of it as sort of the kind of a classical science fiction topos. So, but what is a time-traveling character once out of their own proper time, but a walking anachronism, a thing belonging or appropriate to a period other than that in which it currently exists? So the very notion of time travel installs the condition of anachronism, which is a circumstance that H.G. Wells' novel from 1895, The Time Machine, a circumstance of which this novel is well aware. Because early on we're told how once the time traveler had explained the idea of time traveling to his colleagues gathered in a drawing room in Richmond, England, its odd potentialities ran, no doubt, in most of our minds. Its plausibility, that is, its practical incredibleness, the curious possibilities of anachronism and of utter confusion it suggested. But Wells' Time Machine entered the world dramatizing the fantastic anachronism of time travel, and yet the work itself has long since then become a potent vehicle of literally anachronistic or old-fashioned scientific and cultural ideas. And Wells himself came to know this, for in the preface to a 1931 reissue of this novel, he already considered his youthful tale to be severely dated. Recall, this was basically his first novel. His debut novel was his breakthrough novel, and he was a relatively young man when it came out. But as an older man, about almost 40 years later, the elder Wells declared about that novel that geologists and astronomers at that time told us dreadful lies about the inevitable freezing up of the world and of life and mankind with it. The whole game of life would be over in 1 million years or less. They impressed this upon us with the full weight of their authority, while now Sir James Jeans, in his smiling universe around us, waves us on to millions of years. So what had happened? What had changed in the interval? Whereas the 19th century, with its heavy industries driven by coal-fired steam technology, conceived the sun's light and heat to come from a process of combustion, fated before too long, 1 million years or so perhaps, to go to ashes. By the turn of the 1930s, modern physics had unraveled the atomic basis of the sun's radiation and revised its lifespan upwards by 3 orders of magnitude, that is billions of years. Not this, Wells has 6 orders of magnitude, that's a little hyperbolic. But we go from some millions of years to some billions of years in our expectation of how long our sun has to go. So the time machine needs to be read as a time capsule from the conceptual world of 1895, carrying specific scientific ideas within it that are no longer functional in the conceptual world of the 21st century. Its contemporary edge as a seminal work of modern literature, which it is in a minor key, I think, now rests on a proper appreciation of its historical form as a literary vessel of certain defunct propositions of late Victorian science. And to be specific, the time machine unites 2 obsolete formations of 19th century science. Okay. The dreadful lies that he talked about had to do with the idea of heat death, the notion of the hastily coming demise of the universe once universal entropy is dictated by the second law of thermodynamics, leads to the complete dissipation of all energy differentials, and and this is the second defunct idea, the not unrelated idea of devolution or degeneration, the notion that biological evolution can operate in reverse to produce regressive forms. So the time machine mingles and alternates between a thermodynamic allegory of energy dissipation and a socio-political allegory of biological devolution. On the one hand, the biological allegory is centered on the devolved post-human races of the Eloi and the Morlocks and the world of 802-701. On the other hand, these images are framed by a sequence of cosmological passages depicting the mechanical exhaustion of both the sun as a heat engine and the solar system as a reservoir of kinetic energy. So let's note a particularly subtle way in which Wells renders his story world as an allegory of Victorian thermodynamics. When the time traveler is first moving through time upon his machine, the sun provides him with a perceptual reference point, and we can read his observation of its oscillations as tracing signatures of classical entropic ideas. The traveler recalls that when he first set out on his device, I saw the sun hopping swiftly across the sky, right? It's kind of going as he's, right, speeding up in time. The jerking, and then faster and faster, the jerking sun became a streak of fire, a brilliant arch in space. So the speed of oscillation of the sun's arch is a relativistic perceptual effect of the time machine's velocity through time when fixed upon the surface of planet Earth as the planet moves through space in complex rotations and revolutions. The apparent dynamism, the energy of this vigorous sun doing celestial calisthenics then according to my reading, encodes the current energy reserves of the relatively vigorous world of 1895 from which the traveler departs. However, when he arrives in the world of the White Sphinx in 802-701, he does so under an afternoon sky that soon fades in the warm glow of the setting sun. And after encountering the feeble and effete race of the Eloi, the time traveler reflects how the ruddy sunset set me thinking of the sunset of mankind. So this premonition of species extinction, the extinction of humanity altogether, offers an evolutionary foretaste of the story's final entropic climax for the traveler's eventual dead end on a dim liminal coastline some millions of years into the future implies that his individual possession of a technology for moving within time has given him no ultimate reprieve from the larger cosmic catastrophe. The Eloi and the Morlocks are now way back in the past of the place that he's come to at the very end, and they were merely devolutionary premonitions of the final exhaustion of cosmic as well as vital energies a mere 30 million years from now. Once again, in this passage toward the end of the novel, the sun marks the modulation as the traveler leaps forward to the verge of the entropic exhaustion of the solar system. The Earth, at which time the Earth had come to rest with one face to the sun, even as in our own time the moon faces the Earth, and a bitter cold assailed me. The glare of snow lay under the starlight of the sable sky. More than 30 million years hence, there were fringes of ice along the sea margin, drifting masses further out, but the main expanse of that salt ocean, all bloody under the eternal sunset, was still unfrozen. So Wells's crepuscular landscape here is one of the classic vistas of Victorian thermodynamics. The scene is an emblem of dead energy, the ruin of nature, promised by the apocalypse of ever-increasing entropy in a closed universe. This melancholy vista was certainly not confined to Wells' own imagination. This was a broad pattern of kind of downbeat anticipation of a fairly dismal future that was widespread in Western culture at the time. For instance, Wells's fin de siècle American contemporary Henry Adams transmitted a similar vision in his letter to American teachers of English from 1910, with the lament that all nature's, and he was citing Lord Kelvin, who was the authority that Wells had accused of dreadful lies. But according to Kelvin and his collaborator in their treatise on natural philosophy in 1867, all nature's energies were slowly converting themselves into heat and vanishing into space until at the last nothing would be left except a dead ocean of energy at its lowest possible level. So in those days, the fear was we're all going to freeze to death. Now we think we're all just going to burn up. I mean, in an overheated atmosphere, but that's another story. So in terms of the scientific figurations of 1895, Wells's Terminal Beach is a visionary view from the shore of this dead ocean of energy, the vast thermal sink of dissipated energies whose sluggish waves lie inert within the coagulated ether beneath the darkening star of Victorian solar physics. However, the specific scientific images that the time machine projects upon the future, multiple scenes of both entropic and devolutionary ruin, are now, in our day, themselves in conceptual ruin. So the Time Machine's a truly great, a deeply harrowing story, but its vitality as a literary classic now depends upon a contemporary reader with enough scientific knowledge to place its obsolete elements within the overall history of scientific concepts. Precisely because we no longer live under this hectic and hastily dying sun of classical thermodynamics, contemporary readers can turn the time machine's anachronisms to their advantage by adding the power of that historical differential between its time and ours to the novel's abiding narrative force. Okay, that's part one. Now, part two. Published a year later in 1896, Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau returned to the idea of degeneration, but turned it on its head by inventing what may have been the first tale of surgically regenerated or uplifted animals, the beast people of Wells' tale are animal beings whose evolution, so the scientific conceit would have it, has been accelerated by human intervention. To put this sort of thing into perspective, let's recall that Darwin's Origin of Species of 1859 concluded with a powerful prediction about the coming of a time when, Darwin wrote, oh, there it is. That's what he wrote. And you saw this in the notes for the class. One of his final conclusions in the Origin of Species: we shall at least, if we accept these ideas, be freed from the vain search for the undiscovered and undiscoverable essence of the term species. So this freedom from a divinely designed or finished fixity of species, however, it must apply to Homo sapiens as well, as people quickly realized. And if that's the case, humans are no longer above, but beside the beasts. Animals are no longer merely just bestial, and no ethnic variety of humanity can presume preeminence over any other race or species without itself being superseded in due turn. This is, of course, why white supremacists need to be evolution deniers. However, the beast people are also the progeny of Darwin's equally influential but more problematic, or even more problematic, 1872 text, The Descent of Man. Whereas The Origin of Species had studiously avoided including the human race in the story of evolution, The Descent of Man marked Darwin's major effort to include the human in the evolutionary story. In short, in The Descent of Man, he felt pressed to formulate ways to secure the relative excellence of human beings as distinct from animal beings, despite his recognition of our evolutionary continuity with them. So Darwin availed himself of time-worn metaphors of lower and higher beings to denote greater and lesser evolutionary advancement. For instance, in this work, Darwin writes that, on the one hand, the ancestors of man were no doubt inferior in intellect and probably in social disposition to the lowest existing savages. While on the other hand, regarding the civilized races of man, he writes, if he, man, is to advance still higher, it is to be feared that he must remain subject to a severe struggle. And you'll recall that that's kind of what the time traveler is thinking to himself there in the latter part of the time machine about avoiding the fate of the Eloi and the Morlocks. He's picking up on this idea that utopia is probably not a good way to go too completely, or we'll all get soft and devolve. All right. So, but relative to the origin, this vertical rhetoric for a teleological vision of species perfection represents a residually theological trend in early evolutionary discourse that leaves its marks. I mean, basically, higher and lower phases of being is a theological, is a great chain of being idea out of theological ideas. It's not precisely a scientific conception. It's an anachronism. It's a conceptual anachronism. Right? But there it is in evolutionary writing, nonetheless. And it leaves its marks on the scientific idealism of Wells' Dr. Moreau. From this angle, The Island of Dr. Moreau is a tale about a technoscientific project in higher evolution through surgical transformation. Now, the narrator Prendick, as you recall, he's an uninvited witness to Moreau's experimental industries. What suspense the story generates involves the delay in his realization that Moreau is not animalizing humans, but humanizing animals. As with the protagonist of The Time Machine, here again, Wells places a would-be anthropological interpreter within an enigmatic landscape whose first attempts to interpret the status of the mysterious beings in residence there widely miss the mark. Prendick's initial tangle of mystification, the phrase he uses to speak to his confusion, is twisted tighter when he encounters three creatures performing a mysterious rite. Okay, this is still earlier on. The creatures were human in shape, and yet human beings with the strangest air about them of some familiar animal. Each of these creatures, despite its human form, its rag of clothing, and the rough humanity of its bodily form, had woven into it, into its movements, into the expression of its countenance, into its whole presence, some now irresistible suggestion of a hog, a swinish taint, the unmistakable mark of the beast. Now, drawn from Revelation chapter 13, Prendick's theological cliche, Mark of the Beast, brings this tale's anachronistic structure into focus. We're reminded that traditional or pre-modern ideas had an all-purpose label for beings exhibiting such confusion of fixed categories, monstrosity. But under a Darwinian evolutionary regime, we recognize this category of monstrosity as a religious rather than a scientific concept. So-called monsters do not really oppose, but rather allegorize the human. Monsters are humans in symbolic disguise, self-referential projections onto the abject other thing of the irresolvable impurities of the human self. So as descended from another creation abandoner, Mary Shelley's Victor Frankenstein, Dr. Moreau is no longer, like Victor, a neurotic late adolescent, but a degenerate Prometheus, a sociopathic vivisectionist graybeard, a nonconformist idealist gone really bad, like a morbid Thoreau, whose Walden is not a suburb of Boston, but a desert island in the South Pacific. His efforts to master evolution by elevating the bestial, it turns out, just can't succeed in purifying the beings that go under his knife. All he can do is to perpetrate monstrosity by manufacturing hybrid fusions of human and animal characteristics. So this vivisection plot has typically called forth ethical readings, reasonably enough, condemning Moreau's cruelty, insensitivity to creaturely pain, or perversion of nature. But here in my reading, I'm going to touch instead on the networks of communication called forth in the higher realism of this fable by the beast people's expressed need for an emergent social organization capable of endowing these newly minted sentient subjects with functioning social identities. In this regard, the supremely individualistic renegade, Dr. Moreau, utterly lacks the needed social intelligence. Going from one surgical object to the next, he serially abandons his beast people to their own devices, casting them adrift to form their own society based on a common origin under his knife. However, prior to the final catastrophe of the narrative, when a beast person runs amok and slays its creator, the story brings us to another scene of attempted humanization, right? The basic scene is his surgical theater, but there's another scene where things try to become human, the beast people's commons, where they take it upon themselves to construct their humanity or complete their humanity through the ritual chanting of behavioral prohibitions. I think this is one of the narrative's most trenchant strokes. In and of themselves, the sciences, however Promethean, this tale suggests, however divinely creative, I mean by that, this tale suggests, do not suffice to consummate the social construction of the human. In order to carry out the project of their conversion into beings with human souls, the beast people must invent their own religion. So in my reading, the moral climax of the tale comes not when Moreau is slain, or when the beast people revert to their animal ways, but when Prendick, a little earlier than that, when Prendick eventually realizes that, as in a medieval bestiary, these hybrid monsters are precisely allegorical figures of human foibles. Thus, the demand or moral injunction that the beast people place upon themselves to deny their animal origins parodies the moral conflicts produced by constructing the image of humanity on theological premises of an essential human being located outside of its bodily nature. Prendick recounts in this regard a series of propositions called the law, battled in their minds with the deep-seated, ever-rebellious cravings of their animal natures. This law they were ever repeating, I found, and ever breaking. But from I think, a preferable evolutionary standpoint, animal nature here just means bodily nature. That's the animal, that's the continuity, right, of us and the beasts. So, in other words, to complete the production of the human, the beast people have to supplement through ritual communications what Moreau had hoped to accomplish solely through surgical reconstructions. In a travesty of religious ritual, the sayer of the law chants prohibitions upon bestiality, and these are this famous passage. I'm not going to read it. Are we not men? Are we not men? And I thought I'd show you a clip. Only some people will get this, but if you haven't gone to YouTube and looked up a band called Devo and a song called Jocko Homo, you should do that after the lecture. But that was a while back. Anyways, the island of Dr. Moreau made it to the new wave band scene of the 80s somehow or another. Are we not men? However the beast people may have acquired their totemic tutelage, however they learned to chant like this, it is as if the full text of their sayings has self-organized out of communications within the collective of the cast-off subjects of Moreau's experiments as they attempt to assume and maintain forms of linguistic subjectivity appropriate to their transformed status as humanized beings. So in their law, the beast people possess at least an intuition of their social scriptedness, and thus of the need to maintain their translations into self-awareness through the circulation of social communications. This is an aspect of their brief existence that escapes Moreau entirely, who, in accounting for his difficulties, getting his surgical humanizations to stick, falls back disastrously on pre-Darwinian notions of fixed essences. And he says, I've been doing better, but somehow the things drift back again. The stubborn beast flesh grows day by day, back again. Such, in other words, that would be their animal essence is still, holding them back from what I'm trying to do. the essence, their species essence, which is not a human essence. Well, that's a pre-Darwinian idea. Such unreconstructed attitudes in Dr. Moreau and Edward Prendick are the abiding anachronisms of this tale, whereas the story in its entirety properly adheres to Darwin's Origin of Species with a bestial allegory of the essential non-essentiality of the human. For given the capacities of the beast people for linguistic commerce of human type, I mean, they talk. It is not Moreau's surgical constructions that have failed. The problem is not ontological, but epistemological. That means it's not a matter of being, but a matter of knowing. What dooms his project is the failure of his own conviction in the human status of his cursed offspring. Moreau has not completed the job of constructing his facts. He says to himself, these creatures of mine seem strange and uncanny to you as soon as you began to observe them, but to me, just after I make them, they seem to be indisputable human beings. It's afterwards, as I observe them, that the persuasion fades. And so to see matters from the other side, Prendick must stumble upon their jungle clearing, where like a band of homeless ragamuffins, they gather in repeated attempts to chant their humanity into being. So the human, says this story, lies not in the possession of an essence, but in the eliciting and instrumentalizing of a conviction, the holding to a persuasion that it, the human, is present, but also in the continuous translation of itself into being by social communications. Okay, last part 3. So, speaking of social communications, one of the most characteristic modes of our human social communications is the creation, inscription, reception, and discussion of narrative texts. Thus, English departments, right? That's what we're doing here. So I want to finish today by introducing the concept of the posthuman, and then dialing up just a little bit the terminology of narrative theory that I'm presenting you with in our class, in quick readings of 2 more mainstream science fictions on our syllabus. In my approach to this concept then, very quickly, what the posthuman presents in the first instance is a fictional or speculative image, evoking desire or dread or both. The posthuman image constructs some entity or state coming after the time or the state of the human. For instance, in the time machine, in their derivation from human precursors, even as devolved, the Eloi and the Morlocks are posthuman beings or images of posthuman being. Now, in contrast, the discourse of posthumanism refers to a diverse body of thought that seeks to overcome the negative legacies of humanist ideologies. Broadly speaking, the posthumanist charge against humanism is that its claims to a universality of human reference, and thus an essential humanity, just what we're talking about in Dr. Moreau, these claims are spurious. Rather, in its privileging of all things human over the non-human world altogether, the varieties of humanism enforce a species exclusivity that masks any number of intraspecific, meaning within the human itself, intraspecific sexual, racial, ethnic, and social exclusions. In this regard, then, the island of Dr. Moreau, taken all together, especially in the ultimate breakdown of Prendick's image of humanity, is well on the way to a post-humanist ideological stance. Post-humanist discourses aim for theoretical adjustments, philosophical readjustments of thought that deconstruct the humanist concept of a universal humanity by recovering, empowering, and bringing into more just relation veritable differences, both within and without the contested boundaries of the human. Now, both Wells's War of the Worlds of 1898 and Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End of 1953 recount stories of confrontation between human and extraterrestrial societies. And both of these tales of non-human encounter retail humanist modes of species exceptionalism. Variously imagined scenes of intercourse with alien beings do not lead, for the most part, to an overcoming, but to the reaffirmation of humanist idealisms. And this reaffirmation, or this residual humanism in these stories, occurs both when the post-human transformation of the human is not imagined, as in the War of the Worlds, and when it is imagined, as in the climactic transcendental merger of the children of Earth with the cosmic overmind, which event is the proper sense of the title Childhood's End. From a post-humanist critical perspective, the residues of humanism itself in these tales is the anachronism, the mindset to be registered, de-universalized, and so rendered relative to other possibilities. So our strategy of reading here will be to use a narrative analysis to get under or off to one side of the stories, just a little bit, off to one side of the narratives, and to read some of the ways that their interplays of narration, focalization, and event construction elicit and encode a smattering of non-humanist messages. In particular, it will be through what I call the alienation of focalization. I'll explain this. That both of these narratives posit post-human perspectives, culminating in Childhood's End in a glimpse of alterity or ultimate otherness on the part of projected alien intelligences beyond the closures of human cognition. So let's first consider the very opening passage of Wells' War of the Worlds as a scene of focalization. You'll recall the definition. That means as a scene depicting a specific agency of seeing. So in a narrative text, focalization denotes the experiencing of the depicted vision, sense perceptions, memories, thoughts, and so forth, while the narrator, who may or may not also be the focalizer at any given moment, does the telling, right? Does the saying while the focalization registers the scene. So in the novel we read, think this, and it's a scene of focalization, right? Of watching. This world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's. Perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize, there again, peering down, seeing the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. Intellects, vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes. Okay. Now, in this account of the now vanquished Martians, they are focalized as focalizers. However, it is the novel's unnamed character-bound narrator, situated at a temporal distance of 6 years into beyond the events, the main events. It's this character-bound narrator who has reconstructed the depiction of this doubled gaze, the gaze of the narrator upon the gaze of the Martians. In these opening lines, he narrates in impersonation of an authorial narrator, right? Recall the narrator that's outside the story world and looks down as if from above on the story world. But he's not an authorial narrator. He's character bound, and yet he's reconstructing this image as if he had risen above the Martians altogether. So he narrates an impersonation of an authorial narrator capable of peering down on the Martians as they must have been peering down from Mars upon an oblivious, objectified humanity. So in this reconstruction brought off by the narrator's account, the Martians momentarily occupy the position of scientific observers, figures with intellects vast and cool, licensed under positive modern regimes of objectivity to control the gaze, take it as far as their instruments can go, and claim epistemological authority on that basis. Yet in the same gesture, that they're hardly even put forward as like Martian scientists studying human subjects, that the narration takes control of and renders them as objects mastered by the narrator's virtual gaze. As such, the Martians are displaced as scientifically proper impersonal observers and default to envious gazers from a dying planet, coveting the natural resources of a foreign world, doing military surveillance for an ultimately thwarted invasion. Now, a centerpiece of this novel is the long episode during which the narrator again turns the tables of focalization on the landed Martians, no longer beyond, but now within his own story world. Now the eyewitness narrator literally occupies a visual vantage from which to observe them at work. In the chapter, What We Saw from the Ruined House, the landing of a fifth cylinder of Martians demolishes the narrator's current shelter, but propels him to a protected point overlooking their war preparations. And, okay, it reads, we hung now on the very edge of the great circular pit the Martians were engaged in making. The heavy beating sound was evidently just behind us, and ever again the bright green vapor drove up like a veil across our peephole. Okay. So the narrative discourse as a whole presents an occasion for its narrating character, right? Its main character-bound narrator to refocalize and then verbalize memories generated by having directly observed the mysteries of the alien beings, so that after the fact, in his account, human communication can construct a victorious interpretation of events. But in the main scenario of the War of the Worlds, even while there is sentience, intelligence, on either side of the conflict, there's no will toward any peaceable interaction or negotiation that could possibly broker an extraplanetary expansion of human society that is toward just toward the Martians in some manner of conversation. Much like the modern sciences' cultural tendency to monopolize epistemological authority, the narrator's monopoly on focalization demotes the Martians to the status of objects, and since they never discourse with the narrator, the Martians remain the objects rather than the co-agents of his reality constructions. Specular objects, upon which he projects tendentious evolutionist imageries, but not without, toward the end, a curious twist in which the microbial inhabitants of the earth rescue their terrestrial brethren. And this is a plot spoiler if you haven't gotten to the end, but that's okay. And this is what happens. This is how the war is won. Stark and silent and laid in a row were the Martians dead, slain by the putrefactive and disease bacteria against which their systems were unprepared. Now, these germs of disease have taken toll of humanity since the beginning of things, taken toll of our pre-human ancestors since life began here. But by virtue of this natural selection of our kind, we have developed resisting power. But there are no bacteria on Mars. And directly these invaders arrived, directly they drank and fed, our microscopic allies began to work their overthrow. Well, humanity's putative alliance with the microbes that slay the Martians when all human defenses fail is the most significant moment of posthumanism in this story, of stepping outside the human to acknowledge a non-human power that actually could do what the human couldn't do. Meanwhile, however, like many colonial adventurers into dark continents before them who end up dispatched by non-adaptation to an alien environment, the Martians die of unforeseen pathogens in the bush of a hostile land. In this narrative, on the face of it, this inversion of a barely veiled imperial hostility short-circuits the potential for social accommodation from the get-go. It's just all war all the time. Now, last phase. Contrast to this, what another half-century brings, a novel written 2 world wars after the War of the Worlds. Here, the will of separate worlds to converse, not to go to war, but to converse, is palpable. The overlords arrive not to conquer, but to deliver a dark message. In their ships, they seem to hover over the entire globe, but they will not show themselves. They can't be focalized yet, for a long time. From their own high enclosures, they will only converse, and with only one being. The Secretary General of the United Nations stood motionless by the great window staring down at the crawling traffic. He sometimes wondered if it was a good thing for any man to work at such an altitude above his fellow beings. So brought forward here as the proxy human focalizer, the character Stormgren is the medium for the international authority of the spoken conversation, the social communication between humanity and the alien overlords. However, above the highest human character, which is Stormgren, is placed an authorial narrator capable of rising to a level of observation higher than that of any character, alien or human. This observing frame of the authorial narrator in this novel is keyed to the extraterritoriality of the international observers instituted at the United Nations not long before this novel was first written in the early 1950s. This narrator's cosmic internationalism drives the novel's strong treatment of scientific observation and multiple delegations of focalization. Most consummately, as you'll read when we get to it, the young researcher Jan Roderick's, quote, a strikingly handsome young Negro, unquote, stows away in an Overlord Lightspeed cruiser for a round trip to the Overlord's planet and earns a series of increasingly higher visions, witness of a power higher than the Overlord's, and finally, upon returning, witness of the last human beings left behind at the cataclysm that apotheosizes the human spirit and consumes the earth. But in the very end, the narrative, the final point of view in the narrative is given to an alien being, not a human, who outlives the era of humanity's terminal transformation into the mystic substance of the Overmind from his star cruiser at the edge of the solar system. Quote, for a long time, Corellan stared back across the swiftly widening gulf while many memories raced through his vast and labyrinthine mind. In silent farewell, he saluted the men he had known. In the last analysis, however, this authorial voice, when we just heard telling us about Corellan's departing gesture, this authorial voice, the one that focalizes and narrates Corellan, operates from the level of a glimpsed but essentially unrevealed overmind. Whatever conversation takes place between humanity and the alien overlords, of which a lot of the novel is concerned with, that conversation's ultimately moot. The communication that matters to the cosmos in the end? Is that between the overmind and the human spirit? And that channel, as I think we'll see, is utterly mystified, rendered entirely in transcendental media, replete with Ouija boards and telepathic circuits. In a kind of Anglo-American United Nations wish fulfillment, the communications needed to heal the divisions of a cold warring and decolonizing Earth descend from the cultural heights of the galactic first world to our underdeveloped backwater planet on wings of mystic goodwill alone. Nonetheless, in conclusion, as in the War of the Worlds, this reversal of observation, the projecting of focalization beyond the world in order to get a look back at the world, this is a significant gesture. This is what I'm calling the alien hyphenation. The alienation of focalization is an important service of science fiction narrative as an active mode of social self-reference. It renders narration alien as well, the implication being that an authorial narrator occupying an observing frame beyond alien story worlds that are themselves out of this world is also beyond the limits of human comprehension and so authoritative about ultimate things. The secular gestures of these particular narratives toward horizons beyond the human express perennial desires, and they're anachronistic only in their assumptions that one must launch out beyond our own planet to encounter them. That is, ultimate horizons beyond the human. I'll leave you with the last thought. Contemporary posthumanism, more often, as in the movie The Shape of Water, doesn't need to go beyond the world to find the non-human, but seeks its non-human horizons in modes of immanence right here on Earth. There you go. Questions, comments?
I'll take a flyer in that case.
Dr. Balch?
I'm wondering if one could see elements of prescience in some of these novels, as well as elements of obsolescence and anachronism. For example, my understanding of the Time Machine is that Wells was projecting onto the future what he saw as the dynamics of the society of his own day. That is to say, it's kind of class division and class oppression. The upper class becoming eventually a kind of effete and effectual group unable to take care of themselves, and the lower class sort of holding on to a certain virility but becoming monstrous too in the process. But what he's understanding there is something that evolutionary theory has only come to appreciate lately, and that's coevolution. That is, say, the interaction between the cultural and the biological. So in that sense, I would say he's kind of on to something. Well, of course, he's a very gifted writer, so you'd expect that kind of thing. But I just wanted to offer that as a...
Yes, that's why my topic is working modestly against the grain of the usual approach, because the kind of standard sort of celebration of Wells is as a prophet. H.G. Wells, the prophet, the man who saw the future, and it's hard to deny that the word you used was prescience, in case, which is prophetic sight, seeing something before its time. That would also be an anachronism. That would still be anachronistic, right? But usually we don't state it that way. what's been striking me as I've been reading these Wells novels again is the amount of violence, the amount of, so in the Time Machine, you have this completely, this scene where, I mean, the time traveler is an incredible bungler when you get right down to it. And so the scene where he loses Weena through these futile attempts to use fire to stave off the Morlocks just seems like with just a little bit of forethought, the story could have gone a completely different direction, but it's the Eloi versus the Morlocks, really. So Wells is constantly coming back to these these allegories of colonialism, when you get right down to it, of a master species and some kind of subjected race, or as the Eloi he thinks they're the masters, but then whoops, the thing flips over and they're just the fatted cattle of the Morlocks who are actually running the world. But there's no like Eloi Morlock social. There's no United Nations to get them talking together at the same table, right? And then the thing that in the Island of Dr. Moreau, a really prescient story would not have rendered Moreau as this kind of theological anachronism. In other words, as the mad scientist, the madness of the mad scientist in a way is this residual inability to this sort of residual Jehovah complex he's got as a creator God, who then can't just relax and socialize and say, maybe if I sat down and talked with these animals a little more, we could get something going here. But it never even occurs. And then, of course, in the War of the Worlds, it's just all war all the time. That was kind of my point. But then, when you look at that from hindsight of Childhood's End, you just see that. Here come the Martians, and they're not even going to say, "Take me to your leader, and then I'll take your planet." Right? They just drop down and then start crisping people with the heat ray. That's a long-winded way of getting around to a lot of what Wells the prophet was supposed to have seen was the atom bomb. New, 20th century modes of ever greater destructive powers of technologized warfare. Yeah. But he also saw the fourth dimension as time, and some folks think that was a pretty decent anticipation of Einstein's special theory of relativity just coming along 20 years later. So, so I grant your point as far as that goes. People? Come on, students. Make me look good. Marcus.
Just out of curiosity, do you know how wide of a variety of knowledge he had as far as when it comes to other beings in the world? Because I know I took a history class about a year ago, and it was a history of UFOs in the United States, and it began with the Roswell incident. But there was a very great amount of evidence that took that kind of stuff, predating, medieval ages, very back to ancient history. So I don't know if he looked into that.
Yeah, much. I haven't looked into that exact question of whether he was tapping a a kind of alien arrival anticipation in the history of ideas? I really don't know the answer to that. My sense from dabbling in this topic is that to a great extent that sort of thing is kind of projected backwards from fairly recent ideas of these sort of UFO cultist types who look at like these ancient carvings and say, oh, that looks like a spaceship. These ideas that our humanity was in fact a kind of alien gift that we got zapped. Doris Lessing wrote a whole series of novels, science fiction novels about that sort of idea. But my sense about Wells is that what there was a vogue for Mars, and there was a very avid kind of Mars fan club at the time, and Percival Lowell, I think, was the name of this American astronomer. So they were training the telescopes on Mars, and they were going, that's got to be canals, right? The famous canals. And I think it had been maybe even a century or two before. It was, I think, an Italian. Schiaparelli. And when was Schiaparelli? A little before
early 19th century.
Early 19th century. So there was this. I mean, it wasn't about the arrival of Martians, but it was about the idea that Mars was a living planet, and there must be, and if they have canals, then there must be builders of canals, and they must be roughly equivalent to humans, because we do that too, and so I think that's what he could kind of pick up on a broader readiness for people to believe that there were actually intelligent beings on Mars, and then just provide a little kind of social evolutionary twist to that they would be more advanced as a technological society, that they could build space vehicles and have these high-tech death rays and tripods and the whole gear, and then just drop them onto the suburbs of London, and then say, all right, so take that, England. Notice on page 3 of the text, he talks about the terrible genocide of the Aboriginal Tasmanians by the British colonization of India, and that. I mean, those poor Tasmanian devils, those poor people were just kind of living their life, and then in comes this invading force with superior weapons, and it didn't go good for the Tasmanians. So that's what I mean by so he's playing with this inversion plot of the turnaround of the colonial incursion, and a lot of the texture of the War of the Worlds then is our narrator just thinking about how could this be happening in our pleasant, peaceful land. One day we're just going about our lives, not worrying about stuff, and now we've got these these gnarly alien death ray wielders just trying to stomp us out. So that's so there's a little bit of reverse kind of reversal, right? Socio-political reversal thing going on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, classmates, countrymen. I'll see you Thursday.